Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Thursday, June the 23rd, 2022. First up, question: why are they here? This is from the website Bare Naked Islam. Lamia Kador, a German born Syrian woman and scholar of Islamic studies, was applauded on TV for calling for a future with no more native white Germans alive. Quote, I think that we will have to be aware that we are a country of immigrants. Being German will mean having a migration background in the future. This is what being German will mean in the future. No more blue eyes, light hair, and claiming we're all German. Being German also means wearing a hijab and having dark hair. This is what being German means today. Unquote. For predicting the total annihilation of native white Germans, she was given a round of applause by the audience. This is by far one of the sickest crimes on the planet. The elite are trying to wipe out majority white societies with mass non-white immigration, or as they call it, diversity. This is white genocide, an international crime, and it does not matter how many times they chant diversity like mindless drones. Diversity is just their code word for white genocide because only white areas are targeted. Let's talk about diversity. Let's talk about cultural enrichment. Here's a piece by Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Police in Belgium are looking for a group of migrant background youths who filmed themselves abusing a fish at a water park near Ghent. Some cultures are better than others. A clip of the animal abuse, which was posted on TikTok, shows the youths throwing the large carp in the air before pushing it down a water slide. The incident took place this past weekend at a recreational venue in Blarmissen near Ghent. Most of the individuals shown in the video appear to be of North African or Middle Eastern appearance. Police are now looking for the culprits after numerous complaints about animal abuse were made by the public. On Saturday, a number of altercations and disorderly behavior led the police to shut down the recreation area at 3:30 p.m., reports Remix News. According to the ACV police union, lifeguards had to take refuge in a nearby tower after being attacked by visitors when they decided to close one of the slides due to a lack of staff for supervision. The hot weather in Europe also led to a number of other altercations at outdoor swimming pools, including in Berlin, where groups of migrant men were seen involved in a huge brawl. As we previously highlighted, the most popular name for newborn babies in the Belgian capital of Brussels is Mohammed, with Islamic names making up 43% of total registrations there. Leftist leader Conor Rousseau caused controversy back in April when he spoke about driving through Molenbeek, a diverse area of Brussels, which has turned into a notorious Islamic ghetto. When I drive through Molenbeek, I don't feel like I'm in Belgium, said Rousseau. Migrant background youths previously staged a riot in Anderlecht, Belgium, during which they trashed police vehicles and fired guns, despite the city being under a COVID-19 lockdown. As we previously highlighted, towns around Lake Garda in Italy suffered a day of war earlier this month after a group of 2,000 migrant youths went on a rampage which saw women sexually assaulted, tourists robbed, and shops smashed up. What's the situation in America? Well, and in Britain. This is from John Derbyshire at VDare. We just got numbers for illegal aliens apprehended on our southern border last month, a tad short of 240,000. That's the highest number of migrant encounters recorded in 1 month ever. It brings total encounters in fiscal year 2022 to more than 1.5 million. That's encounter, mind. The actual encounter being tallied there is one between an invader and a Border Patrol officer. Either the invader presents himself to Border Patrol with some plausible claim for entry, or he tried to sneak in, avoiding the patrol, but got caught by chance. Some large but unknown number of sneak-ins did not get caught. The good news is that 42% of these encounters were deported, or at any rate processed for a deportation. Under Title 42, the Trump-era protocol allowing deportation on health grounds that Joe Biden tried to end until he was thwarted by a judge. The other 58% are being processed under Title 8 of current immigration law. That will result in some number of them being deported. How many? 50%? 100%? 10%? I don't know. For a clue, I have this from the Washington Examiner, a story January 24th, 2022. More than 2 million migrants were stopped while attempting to enter the U.S. from Mexico illegally in the calendar year 2021. Of the 2 million, roughly 1.1 million were immediately expelled back to Mexico or flown to other countries. Some attempted crossing multiple times, inflating the numbers, but nearly 800,000 were released into the U.S. Derbyshire comments, as dumb and treasonous as our current immigration policies are, they fairly glow with integrity, efficiency, and patriotism by comparison with Britain's. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say, and I say it in all earnestness, that Britain's clueless, brainless, worthless government is currently perpetrating the greatest immigration fiasco since Chinese General Wu Sanggu opened the gates of China to the Manchus in 1644. I've been reporting to you, most recently on June the 3rd, about the swelling number of illegal aliens crossing the English Channel from France, more than 10,000 so far this year. This is the fourth year it's been happening. These numbers for these 4 years to the nearest thousand, 2019 to 2028, 2021, 29. Estimates for this year's total start at 50, and once again, these are thousands, so that's 50,000. Essentially, none of these invaders get expelled. They plead asylum or refugee status, although that is an a priori preposterous. They're coming most recently from France, where they could also have claimed asylum. They destroy their identity documents so they can't be deported. The British authorities conscientiously process their bogus asylum claims anyway, putting them up in good hotels while the processing is underway. For 3 of those 4 years, the invasion went on with the British government doing nothing at all about it. This, incredible to report, is a government of the Conservative Party, but these are metropolitan progressives led by a prime minister who has, all through his political career, been well known as an enthusiast for multiculturalism. Then, earlier this year, pressure from voters became too strong to ignore. The government grudgingly agreed to do something about the invasion. What did they do? They cut an agreement with the Black African country of Rwanda to take in some of the illegals while their obviously fake asylum applications were processed. We first heard that 700 illegals would be shipped to Rwanda to be accommodated in that country's hotels. Britain, however, is chock-a-block with well-funded groups who favor mass illegal immigration. They got busy lawyering. That 700 was quickly whittled down to 130, which is still a good plane load. By the time the first flight to Rwanda was scheduled for Tuesday last week, the 130 had been further whittled down to 7. The pro-illegal activists swung into action Tuesday, blocking exit routes from the airport detention center and lawyering up a frenzy. By late Tuesday, it seemed there was just one illegal left on the plane. Then some outfit called the European Court of Human Rights issued an injunction to prevent that one illegal being deported. So the flight was canceled. Number of illegals deported, 0. Wait, didn't the Brits unshackle themselves from Europe? How come they have to obey this ruling? Nobody in Britain seems to have any idea either. While all this was going on, of course, several hundred new scofflaws landed in Britain and were escorted to nice hotels. Did I say fiasco? This makes our own border czar, or tsarina, I guess. This makes Kamala Harris look like a strategic mastermind. Derbyshire continues, as an ex-Brit in a spirit of nostalgic affection for the old place, I hereby offer my advice to the British government free of charge. Arrest everyone who lands in your country illegally. Confine them in special secure camps with the right to self-deport at any time. What? You don't have those kinds of facilities? Then build them. When COVID came up, the Chi-Coms built a 1,500-room hospital in 5 days. Children should be placed in care facilities with adequate nutrition and basic education. If I remember my Charles Dickens correctly, Britain used to excel at this. You are welcome to my suggestion that you restore the excellent former system of hulks, surplus ships fitted out with secure cells like those used to handle the overflow from Britain's prisons in the 18th and 19th century. Hulks have the advantage that they can be moored well offshore so that they don't cause offense to the pleasant British landscape the way onshore camp would. They also spare the hassle of getting land rights and so on. Hulks. What's not to like? The tens of thousands of illegal aliens already in Britain are a result of these past 4 years of inaction, need to be rounded up and incarcerated as above. The easy way to do this is to rescind any rights that they have been given to work in your country. To avoid them working illegally, establish an e-verify system based on national insurance number. That's the British equivalent of a social security number, with brutal penalties for employers who hire without checking. That should take care of the problem. So, Texas Senator John Cornyn, who I suppose is responsible for the latest restriction on gun rights in the United States, he made a joke after making this deal with the Democrats. From Breitbart, as the Senate voted to advance gun legislation on Tuesday night, which arose from Cornyn's negotiations with Democrats, Cornyn told Senator Alex Padilla, California, first guns, now it's immigration. In response to Cornyn's comment, Sinema said, "That's right, we're going to do it." The comment drew swift backlash from former Trump administration officials such as Andrew Surabian, House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy, and House Republican Study Committee Chairman Jim Banks. "I'm selling them out on gun control to selling them out in light speed," Surabian said. Cornyn's comments appear to have angered McCarthy, as you're not supposed to sell your voters out until after the election. McCarthy said amnesty was not on the table. So Cornyn, understandably, faced considerable backlash for this, and that he claimed lamely that it was a joke. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Dan Anrun, J. Boss, hi, who says, "Hi, all concealed guns for everybody in New York City. 6-3 ruling. Goodbye, New York gun control laws." I'll get to that shortly. Hello to John S. Quachalango. And Ann Run, who comments, "Seems a fair number of native non-elite Germans don't much mind being replaced." Hello to Chogakin 666. Well, there's a reason for that, which is after 1945, the Germans have engaged in self-flagellation, being told from the earliest ages that Germans are innately evil. So it's no surprise that a great many Germans have no problem with being replaced. And of course, we see a similar thing in Canada. The Canadians are now told from the earliest ages that Canada is an evil country and always has been, that it is a bastion of white supremacy, despite our immigration policy. So there's a large number of Canadians who have no problem with being replaced. Hello to, who else do we have here? Cesare Borgia, thank you for your compliment. Anran says the DOJ already issued a sort of Jacksonian statement on the ruling. Yes, and I'll have more on Andy Jackson a little later. Hello to Brian Frakes. Oh, these hotels in Britain that the invaders are taken to, guess what happens to the hotels? They trash them. Now, these hotels are not for the exclusive use of migrants. So people who have paid good money find themselves living in an absolute hellhole and worry for their safety. And let's get back to oikophobia. This is from Roberto Wakewell Cruz at the Post Millennial. The Chinese Communist Party may have discouraged Canadians of Chinese heritage from voting for the Conservatives in the 2021 federal election, a federal research unit has found. According to analysis by the Rapid Response Mechanism Canada Group, which tracks foreign interference, the CCP may have used accounts across Chinese social media to share the narrative that the Tories would severely damage relations with Beijing. The Canadian press reports that the report was prepared a week before Canadians voted in 2021. Former Conservative Party leader Aaron O'Toole, who led his party to form the official opposition, said on a podcast after the election that the party had lost 8 or 9 seats to foreign interference from China. Conservative MP and foreign affairs critic Michael Chong said in an interview that the analysis shows another piece of evidence that the CPC in Beijing interfered in the last general election by spreading disinformation. The Chinese embassy in Ottawa said in a statement that, quote, China has always adhered to the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, unquote. Ho ho, very satirical. For some decades now in my country, there have been parallel election campaigns. So you've got the boring white bread Canadians, and that's the official campaign. But you have unofficial campaigns for Chinese, from people from India, from people from the Philippines, Tamils, etc., etc., etc. Now, in many cases, the leadership of the party has no idea what is being said. Various promises are made to various groups that if you vote for this party, they will take care of you, especially in various ways. This is obviously intolerable, but as good Canadians, we tolerate it. But wait, this is from Jim Bronskill at National News Watch. Beijing may have tried to discourage Canadians from voting Conservative. Yes, and it mentions the Global Times. The analysts first noticed the narrative about the Conservatives in two articles published September 8th by the Global Times, a Chinese state-owned media tabloid. RRM Canada believes the Global Times coverage was prompted by a story in Ottawa's Hill Times newspaper that examined Canadian parties' positions on Canada-China relations. The analysis said that it is likely that the Global Times was the first Chinese publication to pick up on the Ottawa publication's content, with its two articles getting over 100,000 page views apiece. RRM Canada notes that the timing coincided with the first federal leaders debate and increasingly close poll numbers. Similar pieces published by major Canadian media outlets earlier in September, as well as the Conservative Party platform released in August, elicited no response from state-controlled media in China, the analysis says. Several popular Canada-focused WeChat news accounts began engaging with the Global Times narrative on September the 9th, copying the content and form without crediting the publication, obscuring the narrative's point of origin. It is not an exaggeration to say that a great many Chinese in Canada, perhaps the majority, do not have, their first loyalty is not to Canada. How much loyalty, if any, they have to Canada is an open question. Their loyalty is to Beijing and the Communist Party. China, of course, does not regard Chinese living in other countries as being foreigners. They see China as a global nation. And yes, you could expect that this was coming. This is from Christian Pass Lang of CBC News. Aaron O'Toole claims Chinese interference in 2021 election flipped Tory ridings, but experts urge caution. Yes, we wouldn't want to tell the truth about what is going on in Canada, the experts, according to the experts, because that would be, I don't know, racist, xenophobic, or something like that. My. Minorities in my country are a fractious group. This is from the perennially furious Erica Ifill at the aforementioned Hill Times. Liberals on collision course to entrench anti-blackness. Black Africans and South Americans were pushed out of a key Toronto tech conference due to visa backlogs, as is the way Canada treats immigrants who aren't white. Oh, do you pity the poor immigrants? There's not very many black people in South America. That's my understanding, at least. She begins, do the Liberals choose their cabinet through varying degrees of anti-blackness, or is that just a bonus they throw in? Given that the Toronto Police Service recently gave an apology for their systemic anti-black racism, that is to say that blacks are arrested disproportionately, because they commit more crimes. Reporters should be asking Bill Blair what his contribution to the cause was. Nevertheless, Blair is not in my crosshairs this week. It's oft-forgotten Immigration Minister Sean Fraser and Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry Francois-Philippe Champagne. This week, Toronto is hosting one of the most important tech conferences of the year, the Collision Conference. In addition to my podcast mate, Aaron G., this conference hosts some of the greatest startups worldwide and is an incredible opportunity to find venture capital or angel investing funding for some of the most innovative technologies that are not even in beta stage. Speakers include Alicia Garza, principal at Black Futures Lab and co-creator of Black Lives Matter, Lupita Nyong'o, Topi Awatona, president and CEO of Calendly, and even Champagne. But Black Africans and South Americans were pushed out of the conference due to visa backlogs, as is the way Canada treats immigrants who aren't white. I don't need to go through the arguments about the immigration backlogs for temporary visas Justin Trudeau promised to clear, propped up by an $85 million investment that was revealed in last fall's economic fiscal update, and blah, 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 blah. One of the reasons that, Canadians are finding it very difficult to get passports. And one of the main reasons for that is most of Canada's federal servants basically took 2 years off work because of the corona doom panic. And yes, there is a big problem with people getting visas to come to Canada for the reason that, again, federal civil servants pretty much took 2 years off work. Oh, and she goes on about, AI, the sinister AI and the systemic and structural harm that can result from AI systems. Yes, pattern noticing is evil. This is from Seth Klein at the National Observer. Where is Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland on the climate emergency? Yes, where indeed? And he begins with a quotation from C.D. Howe, Canada's Second World War Minister of Munitions and Supply. If we lose the war, nothing will matter. If we win the war, the cost will still have been of no consequence and will have been forgotten. Yeah, you see, it's like, we're fighting the Nazis, only this time it's the atmosphere. We're fighting the atmosphere Nazis, with carbon playing the role, carbon, mankind's eternal enemy, playing the role of Hitler. No great fortunes can be accumulated out of wartime profits. This was from J.L. Ilsley, Canada's Second World War finance minister. The quotes above, spoken by two of Canada's foremost ministers during the Second World War, provide historic reminders of what audacious leadership sounds like in a time of emergency. Our Deputy Prime Minister and Federal Minister of Finance today, the Honourable Chrystia Freeland, is the highest profile and most powerful minister in the Trudeau cabinet and is widely viewed as the most likely successor to Justin Trudeau. According to recent polls, even before taking center stage in Canada's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Freeland is more popular than the PM and well ahead of any other prospective leadership contender. The Globe and Mail even dubbed her the Minister of Everything. Oh, boo, groan, hiss. But pray tell, where is the Minister of Everything on the defining crisis of our time, the climate emergency? Beyond passing boilerplate references to the importance of climate action, I can think of no substantive intervention or speech Freeland has made on the most pressing collective challenge of our lives. In contrast, the minister seems intent on appeasing the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan and sending friendly signals to the oil patch, instead of saying, say that she intends to destroy, level their economies, because, it's no secret that the Liberals, what they want is for the oil and gas to stay in the ground. This would punish Alberta and Saskatchewan, which these provinces don't vote for the Liberals. And so then we could get the wonderful green energy revolution, which is not ready to go. So we'll all freeze in the dark. But the Liberals are stupid people, and they don't think these things through. She has stubbornly refused to rethink the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project, even in the face of massive cost escalations, instead going to extraordinary lengths to orchestrate and backstop financing for the climate-defying project with government loan guarantees. Yet more than any other minister, Freeland holds the key levers to truly pivot us into climate emergency mode. I've written numerous times about the markers of genuine government emergency mode, the first two of which, spend what it takes to win and create new economic institutions to get the job done, are firmly in the hands of the finance minister. And Freeland's record clearly indicates that when she takes firm hold of a file, she is a minister who can get things done. Yes, spend what it takes to win. We're just going to conjure up an alternative energy system ex nihilo. Oh, and how much is that going to cost? Well, any such figures are going to be lowballed, of course. I'll have more on the Institute carbon budgeting. Once again, yes, let's take the fight to mankind's eternal enemy. The UK, which has by a large margin been the most successful G7 country when it comes to driving down emissions, yes, I think we should get back to Seth Klein when winter comes along to find out how many Britons are freezing to death in the dark, because they simply made decisions in Britain which mean they don't have enough energy, nowhere near enough. William Briggs writes, in which we answer the pressing question, is science growing stupider? I was asked this question the other day, is science becoming stupider? I was forced to answer this way. Boy, howdy. Science will be lucky to reach stupid by the end of the decade if it starts studying full-time right now. Yet it was I who asked the question of myself, but that doesn't make the answer any less true or important, and I can prove it. Using the peer-reviewed scientific paper, Rising Temperatures Erode Human Sleep Globally in One Earth by Kelton Minor, which sounds like the name of the dimmer of a binary star, and some others. And yes, 58 hours of lost sleep in a year, and women and minorities hardest hit. Say, Briggs, before you get too excited, how many days in a year? Same as always, a bit more than 365. So worst case scenario, how much sleep will be lost on average daily per person? Let's see, that's 58 hours divided by 365.25, which is 0.158 something hours a day. How many minutes is that? 9 minutes, roughly. 9 minutes. Dude, even if global warming terrorizes us all in the absolute most horrible scenario they can think of, and of course people forget that they have air conditioning and fans, they might lose a full 9 minutes of sleep a day in 2099. And they wouldn't be able to figure out a way to get that back. The temperature would act like an alarm bell or something. It's science. Come to think of it, the number 58 is even screwier than we thought. It seems that most of the warming that is coming in global warming, it will get here in a year now, will happen in higher latitudes in winter, northern and southern hemispheres, where an extra degree or two might be nice, especially in the winter. Might help some folks sleep better. On the other hand, maybe Minor Binary thought of that. I don't have access to the paper, so I can't tell. But I do have access to the news report on the paper, in which Minor Binary has some quotes. In order to make informed climate policy decisions moving forward, we need to better account for the full spectrum of plausible future climate impacts extending from today's societal greenhouse gas emissions choices. Unquote. He could have said, we need to figure out what's going to happen, which is equivalent, but doesn't sound nearly scientific enough. To conduct their study, the researchers used anonymized global data collected from sleep tracking wristbands. Measures from these types of wristbands, the authors explained, had previously been shown to align with other independent measures of wakefulness and sleep. Say what? Sounds like we're in the realm of the epidemiologist fallacy. It's like they didn't measure sleep, but some kind of number from a wristband which is correlated with sleep. If I'm right about both the epidemiologist fallacy and the p-values, it means the conclusion is far too certain. For if we integrate out the uncertainty due to the correlation, which is not actual sleep measurement, and then look at it predictively instead of by wee p-values, then that 9 minutes will fall even more, or be a heck of a lot more uncertain. And even if I'm wrong about the epidemiologist fallacy and the p-values, it's still only a lousy 9 minutes a day on average. More on climate emergency from William Briggs, statistician to the stars and author of the book, Everything You Believe Is Wrong. Remember back in April when Boulderite Win Bruce 50 set himself on fire to show how much he cared about climate change? Yes, sir. He walked up the steps of the Supreme Court and doused himself with, presumably, organic, gluten-free, hemp-based moonshine and flicked his bick for the last time. Poof! The smoke from his charred remains contributing to the greenhouse gases which drove him mad. Now, this Bruce was a fool doing a foolish thing in service to a foolish idea. The ultimate responsibility for his self-murder belongs to him, but the proximate responsibility belongs to the midwit scientists, manic activists, and prevaricating rulers who helped convince Bruce that there was a climate emergency. These awful people are also pegged, The Guardian reminds us, in the self-immolation of David Buckle, 60, a civil rights lawyer who gasolined himself in 2018. He left a 2-page note emailed to media outlets minutes before his death, stating that my early death by fossil fuel reflects what we are doing to ourselves. Briggs responds, which it isn't. Incidentally, it's my guess that these misled men flamed out instead of choosing something less painful like hanging, because hanging would have involved nooses, and nooses are racist. In describing the crispy climate critters, the paper said the duo were vegetarians and dutifully did their recycling, which seems to me a setup for a joke, but I've been unable to think of a punchline. Maybe you can have a go. People's idiot fear is now taken as evidence that there is indeed a climate emergency. How else could so many people turn weepingly wimpy about the weather unless there was something important happening? This is, of course, exactly backwards. How is it that anybody can suffer anxiety, depression, or worse by fretting about future forecasts when even a casual glance out their own weather windows should prove to them there is nothing of interest happening? That they do suffer must therefore have an exterior cause, and that cause is, inter alia, Margaret Klein Salomon, a clinical psychologist turned climate activist. This woman is an idiot. Not in the clinical sense. I wouldn't dare attempt any sort of clinical diagnosis of her mental maladies. I speak colloquially. Idiot, a person who speaks authoritatively using devices such as nonsensical, hyperbolic exaggeration about matters in which she is ignorant. The nonsense she imbibed was not her creation. That is the fault of the scientists, who hear these stories as we do and decide to either cheer on the lunacy because they agree with it, or they remain silent because they benefit from the madness. The former sin, that of belief, is small or no sin at all in weak-minded scientists. They were trained to push certain theories and push them they do, not only not questioning them, but not understanding how to question them. The cadre of crude thinkers used to be a minor part of science and harmless, but because, as we have often discussed, of the expansion team effect, they are now a pestilence. Oh, by the way, someone pointed out recently that by 2022, according to Al Gore's prediction, we are all supposed to be dead from climate change. Somehow that hasn't happened. And again, this is, you can find this at wmbriggs.com. I came across this story just before I started the show on Drudge. And people say that, oh, the sexual revolution is here. There's no turning back the clock. And it's going to be the same forever. Well, nothing is the same forever. I have believed for some time that, well, to lay a foundation here, a big part of the sexual revolution was the invention of antibiotics to treat diseases such as gonorrhea and syphilis. Syphilis was a scourge before antibiotics. What if there's a new venereal disease that can't be treated? Well, it appears there might be one, or perhaps it's just a co-u of vice indulging in some panic porn. An Austrian man in his 50s has been infected with a super potent strain of gonorrhea that can't be treated with common antibiotics after having an unprotected sexual encounter during a trip to Cambodia. The case, documented in the peer-reviewed medical journal Eurosurveillance last week, was described by the researchers to be a concern for future treatment of gonorrhea and a major global public health threat. Will we get lockdowns because of this? In April, 5 days after having unprotected sex with a sex worker, that's, a prostitute in Cambodia, the man was seen by a urologist in Austria, and I'm not going to describe his symptoms because they are horrifying and disgusting. And yes, it appears that the antibiotics that we have not working with this Austrian man. The Cambodian sex worker believed to be also carrying gonorrhea has not been identified. Anne Chorn, project manager at Cambodian Women for Peace and Development, an NGO working with sex workers, said that despite Cambodia's success in bringing down HIV rates, once the highest in Asia, access to contraceptives remains an issue. With the COVID-19 outbreak, we found that sex workers, that is to say, prostitutes, have difficulty accessing healthcare. We also found that female entertainment workers can't access condoms. Entertainment workers? Is that another euphemism for prostitutes? There are an estimated 70,000 known female entertainment workers in the country as of 2019. Does that mean strippers and lap dancers? Or what is a female entertainment worker? Including sex workers and those who work in entertainment venues like massage parlors, prostitutes, in other words, and karaoke lounges. These women often come from poor families and migrate to urban areas for work. Just remember, people, sex work is work, or so we're told. Let's go to the chat. Mark Butterworth, hello, says new paper says weakening magnetic field and moving magnetic poles is affecting brain chemistry, making people a bit crazy. Sounds about right. Quachalango says polar bears are doing well. Anran says they are very white. That's what you get for having fun in Cambodia, Jay Boss. There's some holiday in Cambodia. Am I remembering that correctly? The dead Kennedys? Earl Pipe says, I applaud the Biden family's efforts in so thoroughly publicly documenting the behind-the-scenes realpolitik in all available digital and analog formats. Jay Boss says female entertainers are strippers, I think. Gamion says, I care a lot about access to contraceptives in Cambodia. It keeps me up at night. Yes, I can well imagine. Quachalango says, you ever check out the magnetic field of Sedona? Seen eggs stand up? Who else do we have? Quachalango says, I dig maritime climbs, but want a 6-month summer. The cooler, the better is my general weather philosophy, says Anran. Well, of course, you've heard me say this perhaps many times, but to have the Canadians moaning about climate change, warming, Canada is, one combines average winter temperatures with the size of the country. Canada is the second coldest country on Earth. A little warming would be very good for Canada. Even in a place like Victoria. Victoria would have pretty much the best climate in the world with a little warming. Quachalango says, haven't been back in forever, but almost peak New York City in spite of Brazil level of crime. Hello to Tom Anderson and Pete Bauman. The most pressing challenge of freelance life is cellulite on her thunder thighs, says British American. My word, she's a vulgar woman. She has this red dress, which she insists on wearing, which is, 2 sizes too small for her, I would guess, such that she looks like a sausage that is about to burst its casing. And she does stunts like she's sitting in the House of Commons, at the front bench, and she pulls her leg up. I mean, all the way. Who would do that? And why? I don't understand. Hello to John S. Oh, and Chad Chadson. Hello. Hello to our old moderator. Glad to have you back. He says, reading the Google comments on these hotels is disheartening, but predictable. White bread Canadians. Boo! Yes, indeed. Indeed. And so now I'm going to talk. Oh, yes, let's talk about Keith Olbermann. Wow, that jock sniffer has just worked himself into a rage again. Keith Olbermann calls for dissolution of Supreme Court. It has become necessary to dissolve the Supreme Court of the United States. The first step is for a state the court has now forced guns upon to ignore this ruling. Great, you're a court. Why and how do you think you can enforce your rulings? And then, hey, Scottish, send the Scottish army here to enforce your ruling. Your House of Lords radicals pretending to be a court. And then some very vulgar language about Alito, Thomas, Roberts, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and what he describes as the paralegal Coney Barrett. Well, famously, President Andrew Jackson once said, Justice Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Oh, you remember when liberals, progressives loved the Supreme Court? Because they're always going around doing things like, no, you can't have prayer in schools, and no, you can't give prospective employees IQ tests, and oh yes, the state of California can ban church services. I could go on and on and on, but they never seem to understand the possibility that given the right breaks, no pun intended, there might not be a majority of progressives on the Supreme Court anymore. And since they're not getting their way anymore, it's the typical progressive response: burn the house down. And, oh yes, Second Amendment meltdown. This is from Bradley Courtwright at Independent Journal Review. Liberals are melting down on Twitter over the Supreme Court's decision in a major case involving the Second Amendment. On Thursday, the court released its opinion in the New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus Bruin case, which struck down New York's restrictive law, arguing that it violates the Second and Fourth Amendments. The decision triggered an avalanche of fury as liberals took to Twitter. And Kamala Harris said that today's Supreme Court Second Amendment decision defies common sense and the Constitution. That would be constitutional lawyer Kamala Harris. Mehdi Hassan tweeted, as you watch the Supreme Court today undermine some rights, Miranda, while expanding others' guns, don't forget that it doesn't have to be this way. Dems control the White House and both branches of Congress for a few months and could unpack or rebalance this GOP packed court. It is not a packed court. Anyone who says that is an idiot or a liar. There are 9 seats on the Supreme Court. And so when a justice dies or retires, another justice is appointed. Republicans have had the power to do so. And so now the balance of the court tips away from what liars like Mehdi Hassan want. Molly Jong Fast, noted intellectual, commented, this Supreme Court really sucks. Governor Kathy Hochul of New York, who famously called pro-lifers Neanderthals, said it is outrageous that in a moment of national reckoning on gun violence, whenever you hear this term reckoning, it means that progressives are looking to stick it to people. The Supreme Court has recklessly struck down a New York law that limits those who can carry concealed weapons. Neil Katyal says it's going to be very weird if the Supreme Court ends a constitutional right to obtain an abortion next week, saying it should be left to the states to decide, right after it imposed a constitutional right to concealed carry of firearms, saying it cannot be left to the states to decide. The difference is that there is nothing in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, about abortion. Nothing. There is, however, something about firearms. Then it's the Second Amendment. It's pretty close to the top. Another noted intellectual, Ana Navarro Cardenas, said, how tone deaf to America's very real gun violence epidemic can the majority in the Supreme Court be? This is a disgrace. What was it? On The View a couple of weeks ago, one of the clowns there said that when black people start getting guns, then, yeah, people are going to change their opinions about gun ownership. And I thought, what is the color of the sky in their world? If black people don't have guns, who's shooting people in Chicago and many other cities? These guns have agency, apparently. They're sentient. And apparently guns don't like black people. Let's talk about the Ukraine. There's a piece at moonofalabama.org called Two Big Errors About Russia by Helmholtz Smith. American and Western policy towards Russia is founded on two serious errors. A considerable understatement, of course. The past 30 years show that conventional Western ideas of Russia are almost completely wrong. But these two are endlessly repeated, and no matter how many times they are proven wrong, they remain the foundational assumptions of the West's attempts to change or control Russia. First is the idea that the Russian economy is feeble, unbalanced, and dependent on income from the West. The second is that Putin is the chief of a band of thieves who, if made to feel pain, will get rid of him. Sanctions will collapse the first and bring the pain to cause the second. Another delusion is that once Putin goes, everything will be to the West's liking, but I did say there was a multitude of misconceptions. First, let's consider Russia's economy. Op-eds say that the Russian economy is the size of Texas or Belgium or Luxembourg, or whatever simply translates rubles into dollars and gallop to their pre-assigned conclusion. They never ask how big the space program of the country Russia is compared to us, or how many nuclear submarines it makes, or new subway stations, airports, or bridges it opens, and whether that country makes all kinds of airplanes and trucks, or how much food it grows and exports, or anything else that actually measures a real economy. As soon as they did, of course, they would see that the Russian economy is much bigger than the pure ruble dollar comparison suggests. And a slightly closer look would reveal that Russia's economy is almost self-sufficient. But the experts tell us that autarky is impossible. But the West carries on confident that Russia is a gas station with nuclear weapons, and its feeble economy can be easily collapsed. The Rand Corporation based a whole strategy on Russia's greatest vulnerability, its economy, which is comparatively small and highly dependent on energy exports. They persist in the face of all experience to the contrary. The EU cut food exports to Russia to, I suppose, bring people out in the streets protesting the disappearance of exotic cheese. Remember Masha Gessen's heartbreak about My Little Cheese? Russia responded intelligently and is now self-sufficient in food, and Europe has lost that market. Biden was going to reduce the ruble to rubble, but Moscow effortlessly countered him, and the ruble is now tied to energy, one of the strongest foundations a currency can have. And still, the sanctions pile on, but it's educational. Now we know a lot more about what potash is used for and where it comes from. Actually, a lot of potash comes from Saskatchewan. And neon, who knew that was important? Rare earths, beer bottles. Moscow is only just now starting to counter-sanction, and the world is discovering that Russia is a major producer of a lot of important things. And if you sanction them, you will find yourself running short of lots of things you'd never heard of. You'd think anyone who owned an atlas would be able to figure out that a country as large as Russia must be a big producer of most resources. Biden can blame Putin all he likes, but sanctioning energy and potash is a certain way to drive up prices all round. Biden used to think that Russia had nuclear weapons and oil wells and nothing else. Maybe the people running Russia are better at thinking things out and seeing reality than we thought they were. Yet another mistaken Western assumption. What is there in the last 20 years that suggests we're smarter than they are? The idea that Russia is a big criminal conspiracy and Putin is the boss of bosses is the foundation of the personal sanctions strategy. So-and-so is deemed close to Putin, whatever that means, and he's prevented from going to Paris to buy cheese, and his yacht is stolen. Angry, he sits down with the other capos and decides it's time the boss was found face down in a bowl of kasha and blood. The think tankers tell us that Putin is the chief thief holding onto power by spreading the loot around, fake elections, and making critics disappear. By the way, wasn't he supposed to have tried to kill Navalny? Where's the op-ed savant explaining why he's still alive? All elections in Russia are fake. All opinion polls are fake. All media is controlled by the Kremlin. The underbosses are hurting so much. So why is Putin still there? It surely couldn't be that he is the very popular and respected elected head of state. To suggest that would be to call into question 3 decades of US and EU think tankery. Therefore, he must be just one more sanction away from being whacked out. And so more names, all close to Putin, are added to more lists, but nothing changes. These two errors run on and on. Russia is now the most sanctioned country ever, and Western politicians still think another round of tough sanctions will do the job. But the more sanctions it survives, the more sanction-proof Russia becomes. Wars are eruptions of brutal reality into fantasy, and the Ukraine war is laying bare the empty complacency at the root of the West's view of Russia. It's going to be a cold, hungry winter in Europe and in parts of America. Can't blame Putin forever. But the depressing truth is that minds are rarely changed. You have to change the man. How much longer will the West leaders outlast their repeated failures? And this is a piece by Helmholtz Smith at the website moonofalabama.org. I mentioned that I was at Drudge, and at the top left, oh my God, Russia is like this close to total collapse. Sure it is. The more they say it, the more I believe that the opposite is true. Yes. So, shortage of fertilizer. What to do? What to do? This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Left-wing newspaper The Guardian is encouraging its readers to save their urine in order to humiliate Putin and help the fight against climate change. Yes, really. The paper published an article calling on people to preserve up for the impact of sanctions on Russia, which have caused fertilizer shortages. Tom Pappert writes, Russia and Ukraine together are responsible for exporting 28% of the world's fertilizers made from nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The three fertilizer-creating substances are rich in urine. As a result of the Western sanctions against Russia, and to a lesser degree the conflict in Ukraine itself, Russia is no longer exporting its urea to the West, which used the urine to create fertilizers for crops, unquote. The answer, according to The Guardian, is for people to start engaging in pea cycling and donating their urine to farmers. Yeah, because we want people toting urine around. That's definitely a good idea. You know, in cups, bottles, whatever. That just sounds like, yeah. If I can use my pee to humiliate Putin, then that weird dream I had last week will sort of come true. Yes, I wonder what kind of dreams this Tom Pappert fellow has. What's more, those same nutrients, when flushed into wastewater systems, become contaminants responsible for creating environmentally damaging algal blooms. So by saving my pee, I could help the environment, thwart Russian aggression, and produce urine-rich bread. Maybe you should have left out the bit about urine-rich bread. It's kind of off-putting. As Pappert points out, encouraging citizens to use the product of their toilet visits to fertilize crops didn't turn out so well in North Korea. While using bodily excrement or excretions to fertilize crops may seem alien in the West, isolationist North Korea has reportedly urged its citizens to defecate and urinate on crops for the purpose of fertilization multiple times with the goal of averting food shortages. In 2017, it was claimed that North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un may have inadvertently started a parasitic worm epidemic in the country by forcing farmers to use human feces on their crops. The war in Ukraine has exacerbated a cost of living crisis in the UK, characterized by soaring inflation and sky-high energy, petrol, and diesel prices. Despite pushing many Brits into poverty, this hasn't stopped millions of financially comfortable virtue signalers from vehemently expressing their support for Ukraine and sustained Western involvement in the conflict. Britain is now swamped with Ukraine flags which adorn villages and town squares and are also flown proudly by wealthy homeowners in their large back gardens. There are noticeably fewer Ukraine flags in poorer areas where the continuation of the war is forcing many people to choose between missing meals or paying their electricity bill. Yeah, I think that the Western countries, that Britain is closest to revolution. That if this actually happens, if people start, starving, dying of starvation, cold this winter, all bets are off. Force majeure, as they say. Let's take a look at the chat. Still suit fall fashion show sponsored by Big Globo. Putin broke into my garden and stole my fertilizer. Curiously, the USSR was never sanctioned, I believe, says Brian Frakes. Earl Pipe says, Putin broke into my house and stole my future COVID payments. Help. Jokin666 says, I want an Uncle Vanya burger. Gamian says, guns are great. I got to shoot a Glock recently for the first time. It was kind of exhilarating and scary. Jay Boss says, armed self-defense coming from natural law goes back to the bell beaker folk 4,000 years ago in Western Europe. for whom carrying a bow and arrow and a dagger was a religious mandate. Earl Pipe asks, could genital monkeypox be our new scary normal? Alito added some nice snark in his concurring opinion, says Ann Run. Earl Pipe says, I just watched a YouTube vid instructing how to polarize one's magnetic fields for alchemical reality tampering. Ooh. Alchemical. And Emma Nimpton says, smash the like button for KMG. But, whenever you're looking at a world-defining crisis like Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the most important question is always, what's Canada doing? This is from Policy, the Journal of Canadian Politics and Public Policy, which is, my understanding, it's quasi-governmental publication. This piece is published by Policy in cooperation with Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs as part of our Emerging Voices program, which provides an editorial platform for outstanding students. This is from Vika Beresa. Kevin Lynch, a former clerk of the Privy Council and Secretary of the Cabinet, once said about Canada's position as 14th on the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index. Yes. Isn't the World Economic Forum, it's not an important organization. They're not powerful, influential at all. That's a conspiracy theory. 14 is a very Canadian number, if you say so. After a series of noteworthy achievements by Canada from 1945 to the early 2000s, wherein Canadian John Humphrey drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. What is the provenance of these human rights, by the way? Canada led the first United Nations peacekeeping mission. Canada joined the G7 in 1976. Canada led on the abolishment of apartheid, 1991. Yes, Joe Clark stopped me from buying South African brandy. That certainly changed my mind about South Africa. And Canada led on the Landmines Treaty, 1997. The past 20 years have been noticeably less impressive. Canada's United Nations standing is diminishing. Yes, every day in Canada, millions of children go to sleep weeping because our standing at the United Nations is diminishing. We were not invited to join the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the soon-to-be largest free trade area in the world. Well, we dodged a bullet there. Nor were we asked to join the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom in AUKUS, a new defense pact aimed at containing the growing military might of China. Perhaps we weren't asked to join this because it is understood that our country has been corrupted by Chinese fifth columnists. Suborned would be a better word. Despite Canada's commitment to advancing gender equality abroad, Canada ranked only 12th on the 2021 to 2022 Women, Peace and Security Index, a 7-point drop from our 2019 ranking. But it gets worse. On paper, our priorities are ambitious. Strengthen Canada's engagement and presence in the United Nations. Support the rules-based international system. Oh, there's a rules-based international system? It seems to me there's only one rule, that the United States gets to do whatever it wants abroad so that it can better confront those who are seeking to undermine, wait for it, democracy, human rights and the rule of law, expand Canada's engagement with allies to promote peace and security. What does that even mean? And develop an Indo-Pacific strategy. Yet despite our ambition, Canada received a meager grade of C on the Canadian Foreign Policy Journal's 2021 Foreign Policy Review, the lowest on record. Driven largely by 2 D+ grades in diplomacy and defense, the grade consisted of 30% for rhetoric versus reality, 60% for overall performance, and 10% for openness, transparency, and accountability. What is it that happens in the space between ambition and realization that prevents us from translating our rhetoric to action? The obvious answer is the COVID-19 pandemic, which hit Canada's economy hard. No, it did not. It was the totalitarian panic of our governments which hit Canada's economy hard. And I'm not going to read any more of this, but I only bring this up to show you, to give you an indication of the way our future elite thinks that Canadians care about our standing at the United Nations, to give one example. And let's check the headlines from antiwar.com. Russian refinery hit by drones from Ukraine. Lithuania prepared for Russian retaliation over Kaliningrad embargo. David Frum is very upset that the Kaliningrad Oblast belongs to Russia. Who was it? David Pinson, our friend David Pinson, called him a Prussian irredentist, which is pretty funny. Russia will redirect exports to BRICS nations. NATO chief alliance to address China security concerns at summit. Blinken-Bennett stress cooperation on Iran. Take action on Yemen. Support war powers resolution. I don't know very much about Yemen, and I especially don't know why it's such a big concern for us to help Saudi Arabia kill as many Yemenis as possible. I don't understand how this could possibly be in our national interest. Perhaps there's something that I'm missing. Perhaps there's something that where stands Yemen stands the world, or something like that. It's an inhospitable desert. Let's look at the Twitter feed of Pedro Gonzalez. In a shocking story, federal prosecutors say two male teachers in Hawaii and Philadelphia distributed child pornography they created with their male high school and middle school students. One had been outspoken against the use of the word groomer. But of course, breaking, U.S. to provide another $450 million in military aid for Ukraine, including medium-range rocket systems. Daniel Horowitz commented that this is the new Pfizer, in which no matter how much information comes out showing the policy counterproductive, it will continue and continue without question, with support from both parties. And now oh yes, quoting the Bible. Canadians have gotten in serious trouble in recent decades for quoting the Bible. One would hardly think that this would happen in America, but here we are. This is from Neil Kumar at VDare. My friend Tyler Dinsmore is a true man of God. In fact, he often takes his beautiful wife and his adorable children door to door in their godless Washington state to spread the gospel. Dinsmore is a Navy veteran and supports his family with a high-quality sheepskin business. He has a son, a daughter, and a third baby on the way. Dinsmore is active on Gab. Recently, a slew of leftist Twitter accounts launched coordinated defamatory attacks, falsely alleging that he had broken the law by making direct personal threats of violence. Tyler was forced to take his company website down to protect his clients. The post that especially incensed the leftists was one in which Dinsmore insinuated that he would protest an upcoming Pride Parade in Anacortes, Washington. When leftists began to point to it as proof of his intention to harm participants, Tyler clarified that if he were to go, it would be to distribute flyers. So, he was arrested. The government sent officers from 7 law enforcement agencies, responders from 2 federal agencies, multiple armored vehicles, a negotiating team, and a police helicopter to arrest Tyler. Remember, this is a state that has tolerated leftist anarchy in Seattle for more than 2 years. Oak Harbor Police Chief Kevin Dresker was quoted as saying that the massive show of force was due to the nature of Dinsmore's online comments, which included violent vitriol aimed at the Alphabet People community and ominous posts about the Gay Pride Parade. Dresker took care to note that Dinsmore owns guns. Island County prosecutor Greg Banks charged Tyler with a felony hate crime on June the 15th. But prosecutor Banks is hardly unbiased. In October 2020, he said that we must cleanse society of Trump's supporters' diseased thinking. So this monstrous criminal is being held, Tyler Dinsmore is being held in a county jail with $1 million bail. Yeah. For quoting the Bible. Let's go back to Joseph Tainter and his collapse of complex societies and his assessment of the Maya collapse. The research synthesized in the preceding pages contradicts the traditional view of the Maya, a peaceful population of dispersed Swidden farmers who cheerfully built and occasionally visited ceremonial centers that were staffed by an elite concerned only with calendrics and ritual. The Maya, in fact, were a high-density, stressed population practicing intensive agriculture, living largely in political centers, supporting both an elite class and major public works programs, and competing for scarce resources. This more realistic view both makes the Maya less anomalous among early civilizations and their collapse less mysterious. The reasons for the collapse lie in the pre-classic and earlier times. There was good reason for the development of military competition in association with the population/resource stress of the middle and late pre-classic. The topographic redundancy of the southern lowlands is pertinent to understanding this development. As a population impinges on the capacity of its food production system, fluctuations in productivity become increasingly consequential, as we will find ourselves today, soon enough. In environments characterized by high topographic diversity, where food procurement systems with different productivity cycles exist in close proximity, it is common to alleviate resource fluctuations by developing regional systems of economic symbiosis. By forming trading or reciprocal feasting relationships, or by contributing to a hierarchically administered regional resource pool, a local group can insure itself against lean times by converting temporary surpluses into reciprocal obligations that are called in during times of scarcity. In essence, the scale of the production and consumption unit is raised from the local group occupying a limited territory to the regional population occupying diverse territories. Isbell has called such strategies energy averaging systems, which is an apt term. Energy averaging systems have been observed among hunter-gatherers and subsistence agriculturalists in many regions and were a crucial development in the evolution of densely populated, complex socio-political systems. One energy averaging system in the San Juan Basin of New Mexico will be examined in detail later in this chapter. Regional economic symbiosis and spatial energy averaging are a method of countering productivity fluctuations that can be efficient and successful, and that has important evolutionary consequences. Such a strategy can lead to the formation of regional socio-political aggregates that are based on economic cooperation directed by self-interest. Regional economic symbiosis can achieve long-term success, however, only in the right kinds of environmental settings. What are needed most fundamentally are diverse production systems that fluctuate non-synchronously and that exist in sufficiently close proximity that resource transport is economical. Where these conditions are not met, and where groups in close proximity experience production cycles with synchronized periodicities, there is little basis for economic cooperation. When a number of local groups each experience lean times concurrently, their behavior is largely without option and is entirely predictable. Competition, raiding, and warfare. White has documented an interesting example of this pattern in the Colorado River region of the California-Arizona border. Environmental zones in this region trend north-south, so that if one travels east-west, resource diversity is encountered, but travel north-south is likely to be within a single environmental zone. Not surprisingly, cooperative alliances among native groups in this region developed on an east-west basis, while competitive relationships tended to pattern north-south between groups experiencing synchronized productivity fluctuations. Productivity fluctuations in the lowlands, while not as severe as in more arid lands, were nevertheless of concern to a Mayan population that approached the densities of such areas as Java and parts of China. Any productivity decline will adversely affect such a people. Historic Swidden farmers in the central Petun experienced repeated food crises, and this among a comparatively small population that was nowhere near the support capacity of the region. The intensive systems of the high-density pre-classic and classic populations would have been particularly susceptible to climate, plant diseases, pests, and nutrient loss. Along the continuum from high regional diversity, unsynchronized productivity fluctuations, economic symbiosis, to low regional diversity, synchronized productivity fluctuations, subsistence competition, the lowland Maya fell somewhere toward the latter end of the scale. The topographical redundancy of the lowlands environment over relatively short distances created a situation where highly diversified production systems were not likely to exist in a local setting, and where neighboring populations would be experiencing nearly the same productivity cycles. And as a colleague has pointed out, the clearing of large areas of rainforest would have further reduced what diversity there was in the area. This is not to suggest that there was no regional diversity in Mayan agricultural practice, for clearly there was, nor that each local group was nothing more than a mechanical duplicate of its neighbors. The argument is simply that, compared with settings of high topographic diversity, the lowlands environment presented the Maya with a situation where resource fluctuations were more likely to be resolved by raiding and competitive relations than by spatial energy averaging. To put it another way, in lean times, the Maya could not profitably average that which was uniformly low. When population in the pre-classic became sufficiently dense that productivity fluctuations were a matter of serious concern, the solution to each local group so affected must have been obvious: raid neighboring groups to make up the deficit. Since the only alternative over the short term was famine, the development of warfare among the Maya was entirely expectable. Long-term solutions included agricultural intensification and the establishment of a hierarchically managed economy. These were not permanent solutions, however, for the archaeologically evident pattern of population growth indicates that, with each establishment of a higher capacity production system, populations simply rose further. The military option must have been perpetually tempting. The establishment of competitive relations among local Mayan groups had important implications for the further evolution of Mayan society. It is no accident that population pressure, warfare, and socio-political complexity emerged together in the middle and late pre-classic and the proto-classic, for as Webster has argued, they were systemically related. Organization for the initiation, conduct, and resolution of war provided a significant managerial leadership role that contributed to the emergence of a social hierarchy. Economic stratification resulted from success at war, as the bounty of a successful campaign was subject to expropriation and distribution by the leadership. And I'll have more from Joseph Tainer's The Collapse of Complex Societies tomorrow. It was Father's Day last Sunday. And, well, the experts are on the case. Apparently, there's some sort of crisis, lack of support. This is from Michelle Cruikshank and Jocelyn Mackey from the National Opinion Center at National Newswatch. The most impactful Father's Day gift? Support for new dads. Jocelyn Mackey, MSCJD, is described as prior to being appointed co-CEO, Mackey was vice president of operations and general counsel at GCC. Yes, risk mitigation management. Michelle Cruikshank is the acting senior manager of Grand Challenges Canada's global mental health program. Once again, this is an example of who are these people? What do they do? They're obviously well paid. Canada's global Grand Challenges Canada's global mental health program. Are they attempting to lower the amount of mental illness in Canada? If that is their remit, they're clearly failing. Are they attempting to remove the stigma of mental illness in Canada? That's what we keep hearing from corporations like Bell regularly. It is fairly obvious that the removal of various stigmas have been disastrous for our society. But keep on doing the same thing. But this apparently fathers have problems that you wouldn't know about. But the answer, as always, comes from elsewhere: Africa and Pakistan. It's Tuesday night in the Musanze district in Rwanda. A group of men gathered to participate in their weekly fatherhood education course called Banda Baharo, meaning role model. They received training on child rearing and domestic duties, as well as social support from each other. Together, these men are learning to transcend stigma about societal expectations of fathers and to participate actively in their children's development. A 27-year-old participant remarks that since starting the program, he attended his child's birth and assisted his wife during child labor, a rare activity for men in his community. He confidently cares for his baby and wife with newly honed domestic skills. Who is paying for this? Is Canada paying for this? Apparently, they don't have their own folk traditions in Rwanda, that we have to impose Western values regarding the rearing of children on them. Roughly 6,000 miles away in Karachi, Pakistan, another group of fathers meet. Each one is a new father experiencing depression. The aim of the program, Learning Through Play, is to reduce paternal depression while equipping fathers with cognitive and behavioral tools to be effective in their role as co-parent. By the end of the program, the fathers had significantly improved health-related quality of life, knowledge, and positive attitudes about child development. Both programs are supported in part by their respective ministries of health. Yeah, where's the rest of the money coming from? Both programs are also supported by the Government of Canada's international development investments through our work at Grand Challenges Canada. Boy, it must be really sweet to get onto that NGO gravy train. We can offer our own reflections on how lessons from these three social innovations can directly benefit Canadians. One of us is a mother, and the other has dedicated her career to supporting healthy early childhoods and the mental well-being of families, just not her own because she doesn't have one. Both of us work daily to support public health innovation around the world. Through our work and experiences, we know that men's engagement during early childhood has substantial benefits on young children or for young children, the fathers themselves, and on their partners. Decades of research suggest that children with engaged fathers display significantly higher IQs, enhanced communication skills, and more positive social interactions with their peers. Mothers with partners who are engaged and share domestic labor experience lower stress and seek greater access to antenatal care. Just as new mothers experience difficulties and should be supported, new fathers often have difficulty expressing their feelings of exhaustion, isolation, and helplessness. Who the hell have you been talking to? Despite the benefits of supporting new fathers, there is a dearth of accessible programs in Canada. Gotta have those new programs to enhance their mental well-being and their capacity for engagement in their new responsibilities. Overcoming gender inequality and enhancing support for new fathers is a critical step toward creating healthier children, healthier families, and healthier societies. Stigma. Wait. Some of the most formidable barriers to men's engagement in childbearing, include service and policies that either exclude men, could you give some examples, or do not provide an enabling environment for their engagement. Social stigma, including rigid norms and expectations of how men should and should not behave in family units, are also barriers. Canada's parental leave policies, inclusive of paternity leave, are a good start. We've been told by these experts for years now that new fathers, what they want time off work. Oh, do they? Do they really? I don't think they do. I think they want to get out of the house is what they want. But let's hear from a new father in America, and his name is Chasen Buttigieg. He, of course, is the husband of Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. So what, did he marry his brother or something? No. Chasen was called something else, and he changed his surname. He changed his surname, as wives once did. This is from Brad Dress at The Hill. Chasen Buttigieg Wednesday called out Representative Lauren Boebert, Republican of Colorado, for recently tweeting her support for America's fathers, despite having attacked his husband, Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg, when he was at the hospital with their son last year. Chasen said that he and Buttigieg's 2-month-old son was on a ventilator at the Children's Hospital when you attacked my husband for being with his family. I watched him take calls and Zooms from our hospital room all day, managing crisis after crisis while our son's heart monitor beeped in the background. I'll just point out we have no idea whether this is true or not. Medical records are private, and it is a criminal offense to reveal them. So Jason Buttigieg can make whatever claims he likes, and he is not going to be corrected, if necessary, by anybody. Chasen was referring to a Father's Day tweet from Boebert in which she said the role of the father is absolutely fundamental to the family and to society as a whole, before she gave a shout out of gratitude to America's dads. Buttigieg took criticism from conservatives for taking more than 2 months parental leave last fall after welcoming newborn twins while the country was in a supply chain crisis. Boebert was among the transportation secretary's toughest critics, accusing him in a November YouTube video of not working because he was trying to figure out how to chest feed. While he builds up his image as a doting dad, the country burns up around him. Well, I would say that if Pete Buttigieg, perhaps there was a genuine medical crisis, surely his husband was sufficient to deal with that. But if Pete Buttigieg was simply not up to doing his job for over 2 months, he had the option of resigning. Pete Buttigieg defended himself after the backlash, telling MSNBC's Deadline White House that he was available around the clock to resolve issues. What's really strange is that, this is from a side of the aisle that used to claim the mantle of being pro-family. What we have right now is an administration that's actually pro-family. I'm blessed to be able to experience that as an employee, being able to have the flexibility to take care of our newborn children, which is, by the way, work. Yes, work. It's a joyful work. It's a wonderful work, but it's definitely work. It's not the work that you are paid for, Pete Buttigieg. And yeah, what is the provenance of these children, by the way? Did they come from the Ukraine, perhaps? In Canada, yes, apparently a bunch of conservative MPs met with anti-vaccine mandate protesters. And Rachel Haynes at CTV News has provided us with a list. So we know who to hate. And in further Corona Doom news, this is from Natalie Winters at the National Pulse. Facebook, a platform that routinely censors posts critical of COVID-19 vaccines, has hired several alumni from Pfizer's marketing and internal audit teams to lead similar efforts at the social media platform. The hires appear to present a conflict of interest for the social media platform, which has come under fire for censoring and banning users who've posted about the side effects or questioned the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines. Facebook's internal audit director, for example, was formerly a senior director at Pfizer. The employee, Tiffany Stokes, has held the influential position at Facebook since January 2020. Build and own strong relationships with critical business partners, provide project oversight of operational audits, manage internal audit plan and risk assessment, she lists as part of her job description on her LinkedIn profile. Leadership requires close collaboration with the sales, partnerships, global operations, international HR, and legal teams to assess and prioritize risks across an ever-changing high-tech business landscape. Prior to joining Facebook, Stokes worked at Pfizer for 5 years as the senior director of its finance and legal operations. The National Pulse can also reveal that a Facebook vice president for global citizens and categories was formerly Pfizer's chief marketing officer for consumer healthcare in the U.S. The employee, Brian Groves, worked at Pfizer for a total of 14 years before joining Facebook as director of its global accounts. Similarly, a former director for digital marketing and innovation at Pfizer joined Facebook as a client partner for its global marketing solutions branch in 2018. In addition to Facebook hiring Pfizer marketing team alumni, the platform also added Pfizer's former senior public affairs and corporate communications project manager as its own corporate communications manager in 2019. The unearthed personnel links between Pfizer and Facebook follow the social media platform deploying its third-party fact-checkers who have deep ties to democratic politics and the Chinese Communist Party, to brand COVID-19 studies and articles at odds with mainstream narrative as disinformation. And okay, let's look at Alex Berenson's Substack. The news for COVID vaccines gets worse and worse. And it's going to get worse and worse. 2 doses of COVID vaccines offer no protection against Omicron infection and may even increase the risk of infection within months, according to a new paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. In contrast, people previously infected with earlier coronavirus variants had a 50% lower risk of Omicron infection. That protection remains steady even more than a year after the initial infection. But the details of the paper are even more devastating for mRNA shot advocates than those top-line figures. Oh, sperm count. Worried about your sperm count? I know a lot of men are. This is not good news. Berenson writes on Friday, the journal Andrology published a peer-reviewed paper showing large decreases in sperm counts among men after the second dose of Pfizer's mRNA COVID jab. Based on counts from men who donated sperm to 3 fertility clinics in Israel, this finding is devastating medically and politically. It cuts to the heart of the hottest button question of all about the mRNA shots, whether they have hidden fertility risks. This issue has simmered since early 2021, following my reporting that data showed the shots had caused excess miscarriages in rats, and other reports showing that measurable amounts of vaccine reached the ovaries and testes in tests in rats. Ever since, media fact-checkers and public health authorities have dismissed and mocked the concerns and anyone who raises them. Now, after 500 million men have received mRNA shots, the skeptics appear to be right again. The Israeli paper offers hard evidence that the vaccines may present a systemic risk to men's sperm counts. What was once a conspiracy theory is now just a theory again. And more from Berenson. He is the author of a book on marijuana called Tell Your Children, which I reviewed in this space some time ago, which I highly recommend. The Pandemic's Wrongest Man, Special Tell Your Children edition. Psychosis. They put psychosis in the headline. Things must be getting bad for the parents if Park Slope, if the Times puts psychosis in the headline. It only took, 3.5 years after I published Tell Your Children, so expect the Times to start reporting honestly on the mRNA shots sometime in 2025. And here is the New York Times article, Psychosis, Addiction, Chronic Vomiting. As weed becomes more potent, teens are getting sick. Elise was 14 when she first started vaping cannabis. It didn't smell, which made it easy to hide from her parents, and it was convenient. Just press a button and inhale. After the second or third try, she was hooked. It was insane euphoria, says Elise, now 18, whose last name is being withheld to protect her privacy. Elise is spelled Elysse. I shouldn't think there are very many people who spell Elise that way. So perhaps they just should have come up, with a name, different name. But everything was moving slowly. I got super hungry. Everything was hilarious. But the euphoria eventually morphed into something more disturbing. Sometimes the marijuana would make Elise feel more anxious or sad. Another time she passed out in the shower only to wake up half an hour later. This was not your average weed. The oil and waxes she bought from dealers were typically about 90% THC, the psychoactive component in marijuana. But because these products were derived from cannabis and nearly everyone she knew was using them, she assumed they were relatively safe. She began vaping multiple times per day. Her parents didn't find out until 1 year later in 2019. Elise's father said, "We got her in a program to help her with it. We tried tough love. We tried everything, to be honest with you." Starting in 2020, she began having mysterious bouts of illness where she would throw up over and over again. At first, she and her parents and even her doctors were baffled. During one episode, Elise said, she threw up in a mall bathroom for an hour. I felt like my body was levitating. Throwing up for an hour? There's not going to be any food, liquid left. She's going to be tearing up her stomach. Another time, she estimated she threw up at least 20 times in the span of 2 hours. It wasn't until 2021, after a half dozen trips to the emergency room for stomach illness, including some hospital stays, that a gastroenterologist diagnosed her with cannabinoid hypermemesis syndrome, a condition that causes recurrent vomiting in heavy marijuana users. Although recreational cannabis is illegal in the United States for those under 21, it has become more accessible as many states have legalized it. But experts say today's high THC cannabis products, vastly different than the joints smoked decades ago, are poisoning some heavy users, including teenagers. Marijuana is not as dangerous a drug as fentanyl, but it can have potentially harmful effects, especially for young people whose brains are still developing. Yes, a loss of 7 IQ points, I believe, for those who are chronic marijuana users as adolescents. 7 IQ points, that's half a standard deviation. That's a lot. In addition to uncontrollable vomiting and addiction, adolescents who frequently use high doses of cannabis may also experience psychosis that could possibly lead to a lifelong psychiatric disorder, an increased likelihood of developing depression, and suicidal ideation. Suicidal ideation is the fancy term which means that you think about killing yourself a lot. Changes in brain anatomy and connectivity and poor memory. But despite these dangers, the potency of the products currently on the market is largely unregulated. In 1995, the average concentration of THC in cannabis samples seized by the Drug Enforcement Administration was about 4%. By 2017, it was 17%. And now cannabis manufacturers are extracting THC to make oils, edibles, wax, sugar-sized crystals, and glass-like products called shatter that advertise high THC levels, in some cases exceeding 95%. Meanwhile, the average level of CBD, the non-intoxicating compound from the cannabis plant tied to relief from seizures, pain, anxiety, and inflammation, has been on the decline in cannabis plants. Studies suggest that lower levels of CBD can potentially make cannabis more addictive. THC concentrates are as close to the cannabis plant as strawberries are to frosted strawberry Pop-Tarts, says Beatrice Carlini, a research scientist at the University of Washington's Addictions, Drug, and Alcohol Institute. Although cannabis is legal for recreational use in 19 states and Washington, D.C., and for medical use in 37 states and D.C., only Vermont and Connecticut have imposed caps on THC concentration. Both ban concentrates over 60%, with the exception of pre-filled cartridges, and do not permit cannabis plant material to exceed 30% THC. But there is little evidence to suggest these specific levels are somehow safer. In general, we do not support arbitrary limits on potency as long as products are properly tested and labeled. Bethany Moore, a spokeswoman for the National Cannabis Industry Association, said in a statement. She added that the best way to keep marijuana away from teens is to implement laws that allow the cannabis industry to replace illegal markets which do not adhere to age restrictions, state-mandated testing, or labeling guidelines. So it's safe. 95% THC, that's pretty much going to wipe out your humanity. It's scouring your brain. Teens are particularly affected by cannabis. Michael McDonnell, an addictions treatment expert at Washington State University College of Medicine, said more research is needed to better understand how much more prevalent psychosis and cannabinoid hypermemesis syndrome have become among teenagers and others using high-potency products. Even so, he added, we definitely know that there is a dose-dependent relationship between THC and psychosis. Yes. So, Biden administration, war on tobacco, also Biden administration. We're not going to interfere with drugs that cause psychosis. Yes. And let's look at the Daily Skeptic. And here we go. South Africa ends all remaining COVID restrictions, including vaccine and testing entry requirements. Daily Skeptic fact-checked over claim that CO2 increase lags behind global warming, so cannot cause it. But that is what the data show. This is by Chris Morrison. Another climate fact check for the Daily Skeptic. 4 in the last month, not a single fact proved wrong, but plenty of gripes from green activists about scientific interpretations. Maybe it is time for an appearance by the Monty Python Colonel, who frequently interrupted sketches by claiming they were too silly. Virginia-based academic public relations company Newswise has claimed our June 10th article titled Net Zero Shock, Carbon Dioxide Rises After Temperature Increases, Scientists Find, was mostly false. The Newswise story was written by editor-in-chief Craig Jones and Texas-based professor of atmospheric sciences Andrew Dessler. Professor Dessler is a man of considerable scientific certitude and has been described as the alarmist's alarmist. In our article, we reported that 2 climate science professors, Dimitris Kotsougiannis and Zbigniew Kudreswitz, sequenced the changes in temperatures and carbon dioxide growth rates from 1980 to 2019 from widely available sources, and discovered that carbon dioxide values lagged temperature by about 6 months. The scientists made the obvious point that in attempting to prove causality by stating that increases in temperature are the result of human-caused CO2, cause cannot lag effect. I went on to note that other scientists had struggled to find evidence that CO2 was the global climate thermostat knob. In 2015, Professor Ole Humlum from the University of Oslo found similar lags in the recent record. In addition, the Vostok Ice Core, providing 423,000 years of Antarctic snow accumulation, showed that carbon dioxide lagged the onset of glaciations by several thousands of years. Finally, a wider reconstruction of carbon dioxide and temperature going back 600 million years to the start of life on Earth showed few correlations between the two. Could it be that we are going to see a rehabilitation of mankind's eternal enemy, carbon? One can hope. As I was taught in school, carbon is the building block of life, central to life on this earth. And let's take a look at the chat. Earl Pipe says, little did I know my funny, insulting joke rumors were closer to the actual sussy behind-the-scenes standard operating procedures of the industry. Pete Bauman says, smoke in winter makes summer hot, LOL. Brian Frake says, good old Graham Chapman. Earl Pipe says, even though they would have enjoyed my made-up rumors being fact and we were on a hate forum. Quachalango says, sin is a short word for a long sentence. Quachalango asks KMG, what about clove cigarettes? I mentioned this before, some years ago. Would have been like 30 years ago, something like that. Maybe closer to 40 years ago. I was waiting for a bus at Broadway in Granville in Vancouver, and I went into magazine store, sell cigarettes, and clove cigarettes. Well, that sounds interesting. And I bought a pack of clove cigarettes. It was a very foolish thing for me to have done. And so I was with my girlfriend at the time, and we went downtown Vancouver to a pub. So let's spark up one of these clove cigarettes. And very quickly, I felt as bad as I had ever felt in my life. I felt like I was trapped at the bottom of a well. And I thought, well, it's the first time, so maybe this feeling, will pass. Or, I will not feel, like I want to vomit, but can't. And it didn't. So after a little while, I said weakly, I have to go home now. And for the next 24 hours, I just felt as sick as a parrot, as they say. You know where that phrase comes from, as sick as a parrot? I'll explain in the actually section of this live stream. Parrots can live to be quite old indeed, over 100 years, in fact. But if a parrot gets sick, it dies. It's that simple. Quechalango says, well, the theorizer of mass formation psychosis, Matthias Desmet, gave an interesting podcast this week. Never let exaggeration get in the way of a good story, says Pete Bauman. Yes, Matt Iglesias themed Twitter troll accounts. Yes, atomization, says Quechalango, started long before cell phones and social media. Indeed, it did. As I've discussed this many times on this live stream. People decided they simply didn't want to have anything to do with randoms, that they could choose exactly who they would be with. And then they took that a step further. I only want to be with people who agree with me about everything and feel the same way about the latest, Star Trek TV show or whatever. Wild knowing Pete lived 3 or 4 doors down from E. Michael Jones, says Quechalango. EMJ is always hilarious ranting about Mayor Batty Boy Pete, says Earl Pipe. Okay. Do you see that picture of Pete Buttigieg and his husband Chasen sitting side by side on a swing, the same swing? What was the purpose of publicizing this photo? That you're Peter Pans, that you never grew up? Don't you want your own swing? I mean, even, young boys want their own swing. I don't want to have to share a swing with someone else. And I'm not going to talk about Richard Ingrams. Richard Ingrams is a English journalist. And there is an appreciation of him in the Oldie magazine, which he was the founder of. This is by Craig Brown, who was a well-known satirist himself. He writes, 30 years ago, Richard Ingrams, 84, created the Oldie. 60 years ago, he set up Private Eye. Craig Brown salutes his hero. Mark Boxer once drew a caricature of Richard Ingrams dressed up as a schoolboy, wearing a tiny cap, sitting down with his hands lodged awkwardly between his legs, his mouth set in one of those upside-down smiles like an upturned U, and a steely, unforgiving look in his eyes. Caricature is a serious thing, wrote one of Ingram's favorite authors, G.K. Chesterton. It is almost blasphemously serious. Caricature really means making a pig more like a pig than even God made him. Mark Boxer's caricature seriously accentuates some of the key components of Ingram's character: his intransigence, his priggishness, and what his enemies invariably term his schoolboy sense of humor. Though this, in my experience, is a term employed only by those for whom all humor is a mystery. It is his sense of humor that defines him. Every year, before a COVID-struck Private Eye put on a show at the National Theatre, the key performers would remain on stage throughout, while Richard and I sat in the wings together, awaiting our little moments on the stage. I used to love sitting there in the semi-darkness along this figure, who was one of my early heroes, hearing him chuckling along, ever hungry for the next laugh. Back in 1998, he delivered the eulogy at the funeral of our mutual friend John Wells and spoke of their days writing Dear Bill and Mrs. Wilson's diary together. They were, he said, among the happiness of his lives. I'll just mention here that Craig Brown, I saw Craig Brown, a video of him appearing on one of these Private Eye shows, and he was presented as Harold Pinter, the late Harold Pinter. Well, he wasn't late at that time. And so he strides up to the podium and starts screaming obscenities at the audience. That's the gag. And it's a pretty good one. Arthur Smith once wrote that laughter is a tiny escape into happiness. I imagine Richard would agree with this. Satire too often employs humor as the servant of politics, as though the comedian's highest aspiration should be comedy without jokes, or if you prefer, comedy without comedy. But for Richard, the jokes have always been paramount. When his Oxford contemporary Dennis Potter attacked in ISIS one particular play for being uncommitted, Ingrams printed a parody in his own magazine of a suitably committed review of the Marx Brothers' A Night in Casablanca. The basic failure of the film is due to the fact that it fails to assert the merits of a self-determinizing stratocracy. The point is so often sacrificed to some very irrelevant frivolity, and consequently, the nihilistic tendencies of the virtually self-appointed seneschal are constantly being overstressed." Unquote. Over the next 60 years, he dedicated his own peculiar genius to the notion that nothing is so sacred as to be beyond a joke. He warmly remembered his friend and mentor Claude Coburn asking Willie Rushton, "Who's the person who's nobody's got a bad thing to say about?" Off the top of his head, Rushton suggested Albert Schweitzer. "Right, we'll have a go at Schweitzer," replied Coburn, and they did. Well, that Nabokov used to say that above all, he hated the four doctors: Dr. Freud, Dr. Castro, Dr. Schweitzer, and Dr. Zhivago. Back to Craig Brown. Ingram's often followed this random method. Was this fearless or ruthless? Mark Boxer's caricature depicts something glacial in his eyes. People talk of his thick skin. He is both immune to criticism of himself and carefree in his criticism of others. Oberon Waugh once asked Christopher Logue if he was afraid of Ingrams. "So I said, yes, certainly, I'm afraid of Ingrams, because I think if he thought that I'd done something wrong and he had to condemn me to death, he'd do so without a second's thought. He'd regret having to do it, but he'd do it, and that would be the end of it." And Oberon said, "I think you're completely right." His biographer, Harry Thompson, identified in Ingrams what he called a relentless capacity for revenge. This might be overdoing it, but he certainly relishes a feud. That gentle, sweet-natured actor, the late Jonathan Cecil, who cornered the market in playing upper-class twits, first noted this predilection when they were both students at Oxford. Even then, I was puzzled by the almost venomous acerbity of Ingram's pen, contrasting with his personal gentleness. Of course, most of his prime targets deserved it: Robert Maxwell, Jeremy Thorpe, the Crays, et al. He picked his enemies well. They all hated being figures of fun, and sensing this, he tried to goad them beyond endurance. In this, he seems to have succeeded. In the middle of Private Eye's long-running feud with Jimmy Goldsmith, aka Sir James Goldfinger or Sir Jammy Fish Paste, the louche publisher Anthony Blonde bumped into Goldsmith and found him seething at the latest cracks against him in Private Eye. "I will throw them into prison," Goldsmith thundered. "I will hound their wives, even in their widows' weeds." I should point out, for those who are unfamiliar with the Private Eye versus James Goldsmith battle, that Goldsmith had Ingrams and others who worked for Private Eye on trial for criminal libel, which is to say, if they were found guilty, they would have been sent to prison. Craig Brown comments, "I can picture Richard chuckling at this. He chuckles at everything. I suspect he sees the human condition as essentially ridiculous, and the blind rage of his enemies its most absurd manifestation." In his brief anthology of wit and wisdom, quips and quotes, he includes this observation from G.K. Chesterton: "It is easy to be solemn. It is so hard to be frivolous. Responsibility, a heavy and cautious responsibility of speech, is the easiest thing in the world. Anybody can do it. That is why so many tired, elderly, and wealthy men go in for politics. They are responsible because they have not had the strength of mind left to be irresponsible." He also quotes his old friend Malcolm Muggeridge: "Don't believe everything you write in the newspapers." Ingrams relinquished his editorship of Private Eye in 1986 because he had grown bored of the responsibility of dealing with the endless libel suits, which were then, as now, the price irresponsibility pays to power. With characteristic perversity, 6 years later, in the midst of one of those periodic crushes Britain has on youth culture, he hit on the idea of a magazine devoted to its opposite. What to call it? Ian Hislop, his successor at Private Eye, suggested the Old Bore, but instead Richard opted for the Oldie. At the time, he was just 54. "This old man thing, he's been putting that on for years," noted his old school friend Willie Rushton, who, as it happens, had long employed much the same act to great comic effect. Friends and enemies alike predicted a flop. "The oldie is a joke. It will go down with all hands," predicted Peter MacKay, who went on to become editor of Punch before it went down with all hands. The Guardian predicted that the oldie will prove that this satirist of a certain age, this doyen of the dinosaur hacks, this Gerontosaurus Rex, is committed only to the cares of his class, sex, and generation. Julie Burchill greeted the first issue by sending a letter to its editor Congratulations on producing the most pathetic magazine ever published. Ever perverse, Ingram's welcomed such vituperation. It was this letter from Julie Burchill that persuaded me that we might have a future. It was such a magnificent tribute from exactly the right sort of icon of modern Britain that it took some convincing it wasn't a hoax. It turned out that his critics were barking up the wrong tree. From the start, the oldie was much broader than the song sheet to Old Bufferdom, its rather narrow title suggested. Its contributors were many and various: Germaine Greer, Beryl Bainbridge, Richard Mabey, Oberyn Waugh, Ruth Rendell, Lucinda Lambden, William Trevor, Jennifer Pattison, and Ingram's encouraged them to venture away from the beaten track. For instance, Patricia Highsmith, best known for her dark tales of murder and recrimination, contributed charming pen drawings of Venice. In its readiness to incorporate the past, the oldie made the fixation of other newspapers and magazines on the here and now seem peculiarly limited. Its wonderful range was best caught by my favorite feature, I Once Met, in which random correspondents recalled chance meetings with the famous and infamous. An elderly reader remembered being attacked in an air raid shelter by a policeman during the war and narrowly escaping with her life. At the time, no one had believed her, but 10 years later, when John Christie was put on trial for the murders at Rillington Place, she realized with a start that this was her assailant. A TV producer remembered dealing with Evelyn Waugh before the BBC recording of Face to Face with John Freeman. "The name is Waugh, not Wuff," he barked. "But I called you Mr. Waugh," Freeman protested. No, I distinctly heard you say Wuff." And as if to prove Claude Coburn's instincts right, one correspondent recalled an encounter with Albert Schweitzer that turned unexpectedly sour. As a student at Oxford in 1932, the young Joseph Connolly, later to become known as master of the dummy keyboard, had been asked to assist the great humanitarian in an organ recital at New College. Connolly was in charge of pulling out the stops on the left and Madame Schweitzer the stops on the right. Alas, Madame Schweitzer pulled a stop out at the wrong time. And Connolly reported Dr. Schweitzer cut short his playing and in a loud voice thundered abuse at his poor weeping wife and ordered her out of the organ loft. Let's have a final look at the chat. Quachalango says, if I have to do gulag, I want to transfer to a Scandi prison. There was a prison in British Columbia, a federal prison. This became, well, the newspapers got a hold of it. I think it was in Mission, someplace like that. It had a 9-hole golf course. Yes, a 9-hole golf course. And the accommodations for the prisoners were basically apartments instead of cells. And who else do we have in the chat? KMG, it would be nice to hear your thoughts on irony, snark, satire, and sarcasm, how this has changed in the last 50 years. Okay. I will get to that. Not today, of course. Earl Pipe says, imagine rewarding your perceived insulting enemies with such validation. An old pre-digital vein of roasting induced but hurt. Well, imagine your legendary corporate raider, Sir James Goldsmith, and a little magazine is making jokes about you, like calling you Sir Jammy Fish Paste or whatever, and this rouses you to a fury. Lighten up, Francis, as the saying goes. Quachalanga says, KMG, what do you think of all that British kitchen sink stuff? Not particularly a fan. No. Dave Thomas had fascination with that sort of thing. And in one of the early years of SCTV, he did a parody of it. It was called Look Back in Bloody Anger or something like that. Very, very funny. In the algorithm safe Tinkerbell sense of the word. Oh, okay. That's a reference to an earlier comment. I remember clove gum, says Anrun, and Beeman's gum, says Anrun. I've had Beeman's gum. It was popular when I was a child. There were a lot of different kinds of gum available then that are not available now. Like blackjack. There's my obligatory Seinfeld reference for the day. Beeman's gum was okay. It was certainly different. Now, as far as I don't chew gum anymore. I stopped chewing gum when I stopped being a child. But it all seems to be, that this is going to, I don't know, savage your taste centers or whatever. Is just this gum, this latest dentine. It's just savage in its pleasure. And really, is it? Okay. The Goldsmith effect. Yes. Actually, Oberyn was quite critical of Richard Ingram's. They settled with James Goldsmith, and Waugh thought that they should not have done so. No more gum, no more Chad Jaw, says Quachulango. Okay, so that's it for today. Thank you all for tuning in. I greatly appreciate it, as always. I shall be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you'd like to make a donation to this live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to the live stream may be made directly via Interact at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And I leave you with this benediction. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.